Let's read an example of how mainstreaming of climate change into macroeconomic projections have been tried, looking at Malawi, which is one of the low-income countries with high vulnerability to climate change. So we have climate change projections being made, and we need adaptation to climate change to deal with the potential risks that are coming down on the horizon for the next few years or decades or whatever, depending on the planning horizon. Macroeconomic projections are done anyways, just so that country can chart its development path. India and China are very aggressive on pursuing high rates of economic growth every year and so on, and keep saying India will be the biggest economy or will be $5 trillion economy and so on and so forth. But coming back to climate change and macroeconomic projections, so look at Malawi. Malawi is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change in sub-Saharan Africa. Over the past decade, it has experienced severe droughts, floods, and insect infestations. The recent trends in the frequency and intensity of these natural disasters warranted some adjustments to the baseline macroeconomic projections. So it's about tempering the projections, considering the additional natural disasters it's going to face with climate change, to which it hasn't contributed much anyways. Post-disaster studies also found that ramping up resilience to climate shocks could contribute to a virtuous cycle of self-reinforcing adaptation and development. Consequently, since 2019, the macro-fiscal implications of climate change have been integrated into IMF's analysis for Malawi. So Malawi is not able to do this on its own, whereas IMF has a mandate to track such things. The following describes one of the several approaches which have been applied. So as I said, I'm giving brief introductions. If you want further details, there are many papers cited here that you can and reports that you can go and look up. First, baseline macroeconomic projections incorporated climate shocks applying event studies. So you use analogs from the history. So near-term real GDP growth was calculated based on the expected value of growth adjusted for offsetting factors such as the fiscal multiplier effect from public investment and social protection spending. So returns on investment in that sense. The expected value of growth was based on growth absent any climate shocks. For example, 5% growth rate. And secondly, if a climate shock hits, for example, 3% equal 5% minus 2% adjusted, so calculated as growth absent a shock, less the historical drop in growth when a climate shock hits based on event studies. So it's an analog kind of projection. You look at the GDP hit that is related to a past shock, and you project future by subtracting a calibrated value from the past example. Medium-term real GDP growth projections factored in the positive impact from resilience building policies, for example, infrastructure, net of projected disaster impacts. In this case, these were derived from historical data as well. So this is trying to say why no action is not an option in terms of climate adaptation. Inflation was projected following the same logic as for real GDP growth, with adjustments for anticipated monetary policy adjustments and, over the medium term, increased resilience of agricultural production to climate shocks. So you can see how complicated it is. There is GDP which is taking its hits or being affected by inflation, not necessarily local but related to global factors like energy availability or food and other things. And you have to include that as well. Public investment, social protection targeting resilience were assumed to increase in line with the latest post-disaster needs assessment. So we look at a figure which provides an example where, following severe flooding in 2019, the PDNA was estimated, so the post-disaster needs assessment estimated climate resilient rebuilding, mainly infrastructure, would cost 4.5% of GDP, and so on. Okay, so here uh, the 5% of 4.5% of GDP spread out over 5 years. Based on discussions with the development partners, assumptions were also made on what they would finance and whether grants or loans would be applied. So all these kinds of details matter. So just continuing with that, larger fiscal deficit, all of these things would have reducing non-priority spending, revenue mobilization, including consideration of a carbon tax, and larger fiscal deficits had implications for debt projections, right? Sustainability of debt growth trade-off is what is always of importance. Balance of payments effects were a function of assumptions on development partner financing and net exports. Export and import projections applied a similar logic to those for real GDP and inflation, except import projections also relied on the marginal propensity to import related public investment. I'm reading these just to give you a sense of how many details are necessary and at the scale of Malawi, and none of the global projections come down to this scale and consider such details that are region specific. This is very critical for climate projections as well as for translating climate risks into fiscal, macro-fiscal issues for adaptation, mainstreaming. Financial sector impact was assumed to be limited due to the low levels of access to finance in Malawi. Secondly, Malawi's debt sustainability analysis included alternative tail risk scenarios where the magnitude of the climate shocks assumed in the baseline were amplified. So you look at the distribution and you have low probability, high impacts in the tails, and they are going to be real big shocks for such calculations. Okay, this helped assess fiscal space and adequacy of existing and planned buffers. So that's always critical for projections. Third, statistical data that would be key to enhancing the analysis was discussed with the authorities. These include macroeconomic and climate data that would enable more sophisticated analysis, including applying dynamic general equilibrium models, vector autoregression models, and model simulations of future climate shocks, which have to be Malawi specific again. Okay, so here are some numbers. Malawi investment scenario with fiscal implications. This is IMF staff calculations based on a simulation exercise for Malawi as of March 2020. So this is done for Malawi. That's critical. Current primary balance is defined as the sum of planned climate dedicated taxation, crowding out of investments, and current spending on climate subventions, less domestically financed climate subventions, less domestically financed development spending. So there is a development funding happening anyways, which has to be always kept in mind for additionality of climate change mainstreaming. Financing of climate resilience investment. So there is some time historically whenever it started. So you have cumulative investment growing, and here is indicator of the investment, and you are looking at annual investments which peak at some point in the near future and then begin to drop off based on some resilience achieved, I suspect. Composition of climate resilience investment includes development spending, so domestically financed, development spending that's foreign financed, and current spending that are subventions. Okay, so again for different times, so you can see development spending domestically financed and foreign financed go up to the third year and then begin to drop off. Okay, financing climate resilience investment. So you are looking at increased deficit, foreign grants and loans, crowding out existing non-priority investments, so that when there is room and when there is no emergency and there is no planning for the future for climate change, you may be doing investments that are not really high priority, so you will crowd them out. And dedicated tax revenue. So you expect dedicated projections are dedicated tax revenues would go up, and so would the crowding out of, or that doesn't change much, crowding out of non-priority investments, but the increased deficit and foreign grants and loans are also assumed to change with time. How solid are these? How robust are these? What are the uncertainties? Always good questions, but not always possible to answer. Fiscal impact, addition to fiscal balance, so these are all negative numbers as you can expect. So domestic primary balance is going to take a hit as these things ramp up and then going to recover back to zero, and primary balance is going to take a bigger dip and then come back and keep the dip it had before. Okay, so I will leave this particular podcast here since it's focused on Malawi and has some Malawi specific details. So we'll come back and look at box 4, which is on social welfare in disaster prone countries. So again, keeping in mind this is about issues of macro fiscal policies and so on when investments for adaptation are considered. Okay.